Hello, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. In this episode, the entire cast is back together and we're talking about the metaphysics of a spark. Specifically, the things that we've seen change in the history of sparks over the course of Magic lore. We get into discussions about Space Jam, about creativity, about Malcolm Gladwell, and even how the Planeswalkers are the 1% billionaires of our own multiverse. But specifically, we want you to know that everyone has the potential to spark and be a planeswalker of their own lives. Just a reminder that this show is presented by Hipsters of the Coast. You can find them at hipstersofthecoast.com or at hipstersmtg on Twitter. Thanks so much for their support. Now, without any further ado, let's get to the show.
Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. Today, like Marie Kondo, we will be helping you find what sparks joy. Wait, sorry. I mean, we are going to be talking about what sparks actually are. We're going to be talking about Planeswalker sparks. Is this still an episode about Marie Kondo?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing. Are we going to talk about Marie Kondo at all?
I mean, we can. It'll come up naturally because I do think there is room for discussion about sparks and joy, even though that is not how we have seen them act in most of Magic history.
I mean, I am only familiar with her through mimetic means. So
this episode is sparking me joy.
All right.
Which actually does bring us kind of to our intro question. This is Hobbs Q. I can be found on Twitter at HobbsQ. And I'm going to give this to my co-host before I answer. But this is a question that I brought up a couple of times on different days, many different years. Because I really like this idea of if you were a planeswalker, how would you spark? I think the initial discussion of this came from this idea that like all the planeswalker sparking stories are these very elaborate things. And I wanted it to be like I sparked because, you know, the guy cut me off in line at the Starbucks. Just something very mundane. So it did get me always thinking, if you were a planeswalker, how would you spark, or what caused you to spark? So I'm going to throw that over to my co-hosts.
I'm Joe Redeman. You can find me on Twitter at Fyndhorn. That's Fynd Horn. If I was a planeswalker, I would spark by just laughing so hard that you get to that point that you've been laughing so hard and long that you're out of breath and your face is red and you're like crying, laughing, and then you're laughing that you're also you're laughing at the fact that you're crying, and like people are laughing around you also. Like usually it's like that feedback loop. It would be that where just like it would go beyond the like I'm out of breath, I can't breathe, and then all of a sudden just poof.
Like you had to spark because you were actually going to laugh yourself to death?
Well, no, but like I like the joyful part of it, the laughing part of it. Now you had to take my figurative my metaphor here and make it very literal. I had a very nice, happy thing going now.
I love this idea of sparking by joy, and I want to come back to that. So thanks for starting us off just all warm and fuzzy, Joe.
Anytime.
I'm Alex Newman, found on Twitter at Alexander Newm, and I went a different direction with this, as I often do. I kind of went to a literary means to books and novels. I tend to read a lot, and this makes me think of a character from one of David Eddings' series. It's a series where in this world there are sorcerers and sorceresses, and their power is very similar to old school planeswalkers, and there's some differences in things, but that's not the point of this episode. But there's this character who was a sorcerer, but and didn't know it. Like most people, their abilities spark in a dramatic thing. Again, similar to most planeswalkers in Magic story. But there's this one character who was a scholar who didn't realize that he had been alive for like a couple hundred years. Because he was a sorcerer, and at some point along the way in his study it must have happened, and he didn't quite realize it until his colleagues were also academics trying to figure out why he was still alive. So they did an experiment, and they hired a well-known defenestrator.
Alex, what's a defenestrator?
The term defenestrate is to push someone out a window. Yes, his colleagues hired a defenestrator to attempt to push him out of a very high window to just see what would happen, because apparently they're academics and this is an experiment that made sense to them. And that defenestrator then found himself outside, because that's kind of when the guy's powers manifested themselves, as opposed to just keeping him alive. So I think if I were a planeswalker, my spark would probably ignite in some seeming, similarly mundane thing, either in research, or I'm like working Excel and I just figured out how to make this macro work, and then all of a sudden I'm on Lorewyn, like, what the hell is this? Well, actually, if I spark working on spreadsheets, I will probably go to some Excel-based plane.
You could be in charge of the Azorius.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe I show up just in an Azorius board meeting.
Yeah. And like your appearance is enough that you appear with your kind of your spreadsheet in front of you. Yeah. And you just basically become their new guild leader.
Wow. Can you imagine trying to decipher like macros and pivot tables, but all in Azorius law runes?
Oh, wow. Well, I am Hobbs Q, and I really, I think that how I would spark is, I think, going to my example, like, I feel like I'm the type of person that would spark for overreaction to something that's very minor. It would be like somebody spoiling Game of Thrones for me when I'm a season and a half behind and really don't know if I'm going to finish. And like when I'm going to catch up, so I don't really have a plan, but then I'm going to get something spoiled and then just like randomly get pissed for no reason and spark.
Well, and then you won't even be able to catch up because I'm pretty sure most planes in the multiverse don't have cable TV.
I mean, to be fair, if I show up on Ravnica, it could easily just be like an episode of Game of Thrones.
See, the scary thing would be if he sparked and showed up on Westeros. That would
next level.
To be fair, though, depending on when the spoiler came, that might be very advantageous.
That's fair.
We're waiting for the crossover, HBO and Wizards, you cowards.
Yeah. So, now that we've talked about how we would spark, let's talk about what sparking is, what a spark is, kind of the metaphysics behind a spark. What is it? How does it happen? What does it mean for the game of Magic?
Yeah, so we specifically want to mention also that we are going to be talking around planeswalkers. Obviously, the spark is a central part of what makes a planeswalker, but we're not really going to be talking about planeswalkers themselves. We want to specifically focus on the spark and what it does. And so I'm sure we'll get into planeswalkers as an idea later on in some other episode. Mm-hmm. But right now we're focusing on this concept, especially because, in Magic's story right now, we are in the middle of War of the Spark, and so a lot of things have sort of changed as a result of this. A lot of things in lore have been changed or clarified in relation to the spark. So let's just start with Dat Sparkdo. The first thing that you might be asking is how likely is it that I am a latent planeswalker? And essentially, this is a question that was answered by Doug Beyer in his Savor the Flavor column back in 2009, so a good decade ago. The closest thing we have to canon on this right now is that it is a 1 in a million that you have a latent spark inside you. So, for reference, Earth has about, 7 billion people now? Is that about right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
thereabouts.
Give or take.
About 7,000 of us have a latent planeswalker spark. Now, you might be saying, hey, that's a lot of people. That is a lot of potential planeswalkers. Holy crap, we are going to have a lot of planeswalkers soon. Like, this is great. But that's not, or bad, or terrible, depending on how you see all these things.
Yeah.
War of the Spark's not going so well. But the next question then is, okay, well, no, how many people have that spark ignite? And that's the thing is it's a rare occurrence that this latent magical potential blooms and blossoms and erupts. So it's much, much, much fewer. I don't believe that Doug gives any sort of odds on this, but it's more of probably like 1 in a million on that too. So somebody else can do the odds here. I guess it would be like what, 1 in a trillion that you have a latent spark and will spark. So it's a very rare thing to actually have this quality in the multiverse. So that kind of gives us the parameters of what this all looks like. But now let's talk about the spark itself. So the Planeswalker spark is this magical power and potential that is sort of imprinted on a living being's soul, for lack of a better term. I don't remember if this was this was not a Doug Beyer. This was Kelly Biggs and Ethan Fleischer who talked about it's essentially a little bit of ether, the material that's in the Blind Eternities, and specifically might be a part of the Blind Eternities that's imprinted on a being's soul as it becomes embodied. What they said in these internal documents for Wizards is that this is this magical imprint on somebody's soul, on your essence of being. It's sort of a birthmark. And so the theory that they had, at least, and this has never been sort of canonized in any public literature or on cards or anything, but the internal documents said that this is like the life force of all beings is tied to ether, and we're starting to see a little bit of that start to pan out with Kaladesh, I think. But with the Planeswalker spark, even the latent ones, it's almost like there's an additional couple of strands tying you to the Blind Eternities, and that's what gives a Planeswalker the ability to move through that without being harmed.
And another aspect of that, if you don't mind me jumping into that, I think is interesting, but maybe we go into in more detail later. That spark, and this is according to a blog post by Doug Beyer, it's kind of confirmed in this blog post, but having a spark is what allows Planeswalkers to draw mana from multiple planes. A lot of the more recent stories don't focus on the mechanics of mana as much as they did in earlier ones, where the wizards, whatever character was casting a spell, was literally tapping energy from a land that they knew, of a place they had been. And Planeswalkers, apparently the spark allows them to do this not just from lands of their own plane or the plane that they are currently in, but also of other planes. And especially when we get into kind of the differences between the old walkers and the new walkers, this is one of the few things that sets new walkers apart on an individual basis from just normal people on a plane.
Yeah.
They have this higher potential for power. It's not necessarily that they automatically are more powerful.
Yeah, and that's maybe a good way to put it. It's a higher potential for power. It's like having a larger jar to fill, essentially, and yeah, it's whereas we saw in stories like the Weatherlight Saga, Gerard could cast a spell using mana from Benalia, even if he was on Phyrexia. Now that's a power that only Planeswalkers have. And we could get into all the theories about, like, maybe, the mending fixed that, and so now, since there are fewer fractures in the fabric of the multiverse, you have to be a more powerful being to, find those channels.
You need that connection to the multiverse to allow you to tap energy from elsewhere.
Yeah, and part of this is due to the fact that there's kind of been revisions within the history of Magic. There was this idea of Planeswalkers and sparks, even from, some of the early novels. Arena, the very first one, was just kind of this idea that you could, incredible amounts of mana being hoarded, which is interesting when we get to now Bolas hoarding or Bolas collecting sparks, but it was this idea that it was mainly mana that was being hoarded. And we've kind of moved kind of through that. Now, one thing I will say is that we know now is sparks occur randomly.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot be created artificially, at least where we are currently and what we know. They can be transferred, and they can be stored, which is just a really interesting, weird idea, which is kind of... So it deals with certain characters. That's mainly been to give characters these godlike powers who weren't planeswalkers in old stories, but we have had them being contained in some way.
Yeah, so specifically examples of the transfer, that's been a little more recent that we've seen transfers happen as things in stories. So like Glissa's spark, when she died the first time, transferred to Slowbad. Originally Memnarch on Mirrodin tried to get it transferred to him, but then they both died in this explosion, and it transferred to Slowbad because he was the nearest living thing. We had Venser, who transferred his spark to Karn, also on Mirrodin. Mirrodin is a lot of spark transfer things happening. Interesting.
Yeah, maybe maybe there is something going on. To be fair, this isn't the first time Karn has had one transferred to him.
He's
not
true.
the best at keeping them.
No, he really needs to take better care of these things, considering how rare they are.
Yeah.
And then there was obviously the earliest one I think that we know of was Galatian, who was the latent planeswalker of the Thrawn. His spark got transferred into the Might Stone and Weak Stone, the artifacts that then became a part of Urza when he sparked, and so there's a theory that it wasn't actually Urza who had a latent planeswalker spark. Maybe that was just Glacian's spark. Maybe he also had a spark and the two combined. We're unsure. But then eventually, once Urza died in the end of Apocalypse, his spark or both of those sparks transferred to Karn. So transfers happened a decent amount. There has been the containment. Ravadel did that to Altair of Colony. Yawgmoth did that to Glacian, again transferring the sparks out of him into the Mightstone and Weakstone. So there's a lot of weird things that go on. It's this part of you, and I think again, like you said, Hobbs, it's gone from being this sort of innate mana power where depending on how large of a spell you cast, you could walk from one plane to another, to now it's much more of a specific soul imprint thing. I think as we go forward in Magic history, it's gotten more defined, but some of those definitions kind of do contradict previous stuff we have learned. And I don't think that detracts from it in story, though. You know, it's sort of this thing of planeswalkers are almost like unfathomable beings. We're learning more about them as we come in contact with more of them, sort of.
And I think the spark is kind of an unfathomable thing that affects the beings. I mean, the beings, I think in the old walkers, if we want to talk about that a little bit, because if their sparks were different, they were more unfathomable. And I think it's part of how Wizards has been doing their storytelling. And I think it's been a very good change that the individuals who are planeswalkers are much more, I guess, fathomable. They're much more, I don't want to say human, because many of them aren't humans, but they're much more...
They're vulnerable. They can be hurt. They can die. I mean, they can. Yeah.
Yes, and that's all true. What I was trying to get is they're people. That is they're
not
people
gods.
And characters that we can relate to. Exactly. They are not gods. They're not unfathomable forces, which is what many of the old walkers were. Even the ones who were people-like had a tendency towards acting more deific and being more on the god end of the spectrum, just because of the power level they had. It was harder for them to relate to individuals and events in a human level way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that potential for power is in any planeswalker spark, or that's a part of any planeswalker sparking, but it is the ones who fulfilled a lot of that potential. Sort of it kind of distanced them from their humanity or their humility in a way that it's almost the wealth of magical capability, that they became the magical 1%. Well, and so the Planeswalker Spark in and of itself did change during the Mending, the event that happened during the Time Spiral block, where those old walkers who did have godlike powers that could, literally create worlds, that was the reserve of power that the Spark allowed for them back in the day. We now have Planeswalkers who are able to walk between planes. They are more I think I would say they're still probably more magically capable than the average bear, but they're not crazy powerful.
It doesn't come with a great well of power automatically, and that was kind of how the spark and planeswalkers were set up before, that they spark and they are immediately imbued with this great well of power, and now they kind of have to go out and build that power themselves.
Right, you gotta work for it.
The sparks were used to seal these rifts, and I if you listen to enough, Vorthos storycast, you're going to hear the Mending mentioned a lot. And the Mending was an event happened during the Time Spiral block, a little over a decade ago at this point in the real world, and something like 50 years in game. I knew it was a while, but it wasn't one of those in ancient millennia sort of things. But anyway, basically the plane of Dominaria had so many apocalypse that it was starting to fracture, and Dominaria being like a center pillar of the multiverse was also beginning to just start to crumble. And so in that trilogy, the three sets, the three novels relating to those three sets of the Time Spiral block, a group of mostly planeswalkers, but a handful of other people on Dominaria basically went around trying to heal these rifts. And for the most part, they were healed by a planeswalker, usually who had some tie to what caused this apocalypse rift, giving up their spark to help to heal the multiverse. And I believe, Joe, have you read these recently?
Yes, I have. Yep.
Okay, so then you could talk a little more to that. You mentioned earlier about how the sparks changed, because there was talk, I think, in the Future site, but it's been years since I read them, about the multiverse sort of shifting now that this whole disaster was averted. It's not doing that again. And so now Planeswalker sparks work differently so that they don't destabilize everything like they almost did.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly it. There's just much less magical impact on the fabric of reality by planeswalker actions now. A big thing that has been theorized behind the scenes about what happened with the Mending is that essentially any spell that is cast has an effect on the plane that you're on, the blind eternities, the ether, your own life force, all this sort of stuff. But depending on the magnitude of that spell, and maybe the destructive power and all this sort of stuff, depending on how big essentially the spell is, that sort of shapes the impact that happens. It kind of makes sense, right? I mean, it's the mass equals force. Force equals mass times acceleration, that sort of thing. Where yes, this thing, the ball hits the wall reacts to the ball hitting the wall. There's all sorts of it makes sense when you think about it.
It's the ripples going out on the water.
I mean, it's the action and reaction. There isn't things just happening without consequences.
Absolutely, and so now though, because the sparks have much less scooping power, essentially, if we want to think of it as like a jar, they're much smaller jars that a spark gives somebody. There's much less of the water around that can be disturbed or disrupted by any single jar, or any single scoop from any single jar. I think it's interesting too that some theories have said that there's absolutely no canonicity to this too. This is absolutely just speculation, but I think it's cool. Is that sparks occurred from the multiverse being destabilized, or sort of needing things to sort of balance out magical imbalances in the multiverse. I really kind of like that idea. It's very similar actually to the Star Wars theory of the Force balancing itself in a grand cosmic sense, but that the imprints that the Blind Eternities leave on souls tend to occur more when there is more imbalance happening, so that those powers can then work to hopefully restabilize the multiverse. It's this like cosmic level galaxy brain type stuff that I'm like,
well,
ooh.
I mean, to be fair, I mean we have the whole idea of things finding balance, like the Force in literature, but that is also how things function on the physical world. I mean, we have this idea of entropy, and for there to be order in one area, there needs to be chaos in another. And the only way you can have order come about would be for chaos to belong. I mean, the universe is constantly correcting itself based on creation of order and chaos.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
Because we can't create or destroy matter. Basically, it's kind of that's beyond the laws of what we believe can happen. It just gets converted. It gets changed in some ways. And in some ways, it is a balancing. It is a return to stasis. It's that idea that systems at rest will remain at rest. I mean, it's that idea that you're trying to return to some sort of baseline.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And this is entirely not canon, not anywhere. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but you mentioned the force of entropy, Hobbes. The everything inevitably declines. Everything moves towards kind of nothing. And it would be really interesting to me, like the idea that maybe sparks were an attempt to combat entropy. If that makes sense. You're putting energy into the system, but then the old sparks were just too much energy in one place, and it was destabilizing in different ways. I don't know. That may not mean anything, but
no, yeah,
it's an interesting idea.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that is that theory of, when the rifts, the time rifts on Dominaria had to be sealed, that the sparks of planeswalkers, specifically planeswalkers that were involved in the creation of those rifts, had to sacrifice their sparks for it. I think that's exactly it. And I think the biggest thing that we've seen with War of the Spark is this is the first time that we've physically seen what a spark looks like, thanks to the machinations of a one Mr. N. Bolas. And we now at least the way that it was harvested and shown in War of the Spark, it's sort of this, like, I don't know, if you put your two fists together, and it's sort of about that size of like a glowing ball of white bluish light that has sort of like a tail trail like a comet behind it when it moves. And we see that from the possibly thousands of nameless planeswalkers trapped on Ravnica whose sparks are being harvested. Sorry, spoilers. Whose sparks are being harvested by Mr. Bolas as part of his plan to return to near godhood as a pre-mending planeswalker. His theory, and this is why I kind of like the theory actually, that Urza's power is because his own spark combined with another powerful planeswalker spark. Bolas is taking all of these sparks powers and trying to put them into his own capability. It's like he's grabbing everybody's jars and smushing it into one really big bowl. Nickel bowl.
Wow.
I almost found myself following along and nodding.
The universe leans toward entropy, and so do my metaphors.
No,
So the universe invented puns in order to combat entropy?
The universe invented me to combat sense.
that's canon. I mean, so what we have here is that yes, we get to actually see these sparks flying as little glowing balls up into the air and moving towards Nicol Bolas through the use of a spell. So once again, we're seeing basically sparks being moved or transferred through magic, through spell.
Yep.
Now, we did get some helpful information about, I think, tying along to what you said, Joe, in some ways, that these sparks are part of a person's soul, or they're intertwined with the person, in the sense that having the spark ripped out did not just leave people like back to not being planeswalkers, which is something that we had discussed on our episode when we were ranking what was going to happen. Not knowing at that point, did desparking actually mean death? Because we've seen sparks inactive. Obnixilis, spark was inactive, got it back. We've seen them transferred. So we've seen them transferred without the person being killed. So the question kind of became, well, what happened? And Mark Rosewater said, Eternals harvesting sparks, you're done. I mean, they're tied to you. I mean, now we have Mark Rosewater's lovely wording, which is harvested by an Eternal. So we don't fully know, except we did see anybody who got what we did see. The story gave us a really good indication of what it was to have your spark ripped out of you from a character point of view, intertwined not only with your magical ability, but with who you are.
Right.
Yeah, and some of it, like the difference, going back just a little bit, but thinking about the difference between an Eternal harvesting a spark versus the sparks being given up or transferred, may come down. Obviously, it obviously comes down to the method of how it's done. In Mark, a different blog post, Mark Rosewater does clarify that the way Bolas did it was lethal because he didn't care about them surviving. So in that way, it is a thing that is tied deeply to you, and it's a thing that if ripped out, will kill you, because something's being torn. But there must be methods then where that thing can kind of be released without it tearing everything else out too.
Right, because we saw, like, for instance, Teferi volunteered his spark willingly, and Karn did as well, to close up 2 time rifts on Dominaria, and they survived, obviously.
Yep.
But yeah, when it's something forcibly taken, and I'm sure it's your body and soul's natural instinct to cling on to that thing, and it just gets pulled in half, maybe, basically.
Yeah, or it all gets ripped out together.
Yeah. And I wonder, too, and so one thing that some have already asked questions about a little bit with the whole, the way Bolas did it, he didn't care about them surviving, is why when Bolas is desparked, how does he survive? And I think part of the implied thing part of the implied element of that is that Ugin and Jace, who did lead to Bolas desparking specifically, that they were trying to preserve Bolas so that, Bolas could be locked away and imprisoned. I wonder, though, a little bit if some of it has to do with power as well, or power level capability, because you think about some of these unknown nameless planeswalkers, they might not have been even at like sort of the power level of our characters in sort of the central Magic storyline. They might have just been fledgling. We did see, I think, a few that were very fledgling planeswalkers, one who other than Teo, who like just sparked there and was like, oh, what's going on, and then gets harvested immediately. But then you have somebody like Bolas, who's lived for tens of thousands of years and has a certain amount of innate magical ability and willpower as well, that possibly, and this is all headcanon because, of course, Mark specifically said it was methodology, but maybe part of it too is that if you have the power to survive, that there's a certain amount of power and resistance that you have to survive something like that. I don't know.
Or your jerk of a brother doesn't want you to die because he wants to torture you.
There's some
for
outside
like
nerf.
eternity, and I would watch that show.
You know, it's just waiting for Godot with dragons, right?
It's
Man,
it's just it's Big Brother with only 2 people in the house, and only one of them can leave.
Oh man, but then that does sort of get us into the question, I guess. You know, when we've talked a little bit about what the spark means for the characters in the multiverse, you know, what it represents. It represents magical potential. It's part of their souls and their innate identities. But of course, on Goblin Lore, we always want to tie stuff into the real world and talk about what's the point? What does this mean for us? And so I want to ask you guys, what to you then is sort of our real world analog to the Planeswalker spark?
There is an interesting point. Now, we know that sparks occur naturally. My take on it is mainly to do what you talked about, Joe, in this concept of latent versus kind of actually sparking. So you can have the spark and not spark, which is actually kind of, I know they talk about it not being genetics, like these aren't passed down through lineages, but it does kind of come to a nature versus nurture discussion that can happen somewhat with mental health being expressed and mental illness showing up, in that having a spark or having the like genetic makeup or something within you that is likely from a biological standpoint to develop mental illness isn't enough. There has to be something that causes it to spark. There has to be an interplay between your environment and what goes on. This is why I do find this idea of sparking and the act of that being ignited to be the interesting thing. We made our jokes at the beginning of the episode about how we would each spark. What we have seen in Magic is mainly spark through trauma or negative events. And it's basically that type of an event took this latent ability, if we're going at it from that part, and it is what jump-started it. Now, we know that it's basically anything with an intense situation can make it spark. One of the things that kind of does sound sad is that if that is joy or some other emotion that causes you to spark, if I'm holding my life in my hand, Maria Kondo style, and I look at it and it's great, and I decide that, you know, it does spark me joy, the way we've seen planeswalking when people spark is they leave where they're at. It actually takes them away from the environment. In the novel with Teo, we actually have a description where they're talking about it basically right at the moment of death saved him, or right at the moment of death it can take you away from that situation. So because what we've seen is this idea that sparking causes you to leave, it could be one of the reasons we haven't seen intense emotions that are more pleasant be what has caused the sparking, because then we'd have almost a tragedy in and of itself right there. All of this is to say, for me, the like real world connection just comes back to this idea that intense emotions at any end of the spectrum, if we kind of have propensity to be at risk for developing, say, depression, anxiety, any of it, can occur because of that. We all have potential in us to have this happen. It doesn't mean that all of us are going to, which I think plays nicely into that idea of what does it mean to have a latent spark versus what does it mean to actually have the spark ignite as a concept.
I don't have anything to add to that, but I have something different I want to say. So I'm going to transition by pointing at the transition and saying, see? And then moving on.
There's a transition right there.
There's a transition. Like, I think
across my room.
That was great, Hobbs, and I wish I could contribute to that. But instead, I'm going to contribute by doing something else. A different idea of... Because as this episode's been going, I've been trying to think of, you know, what is a real-world analog for a spark? This idea of something that suddenly changes, and then now you are different. And I think that, obviously, there's a lot of literal differences to an actual spark, but in a lot of ways there are parallels in real life. There are certainly times where something will happen in a good or a negative way where now you are different. Now you have a new path. There is a new avenue. to be actually, hey, look at this, I can tie into what you were talking about, Hobbs, to talk about an example that I can think of is my finally being diagnosed with my social anxiety. Now my life can change. I can go in a different path. And so it's not the same, because in that you could have dozens of moments like that in your life as things shift, as things move. But I think there is some parallels there to a moment of sparking.
I think about it too in a similar sense, that it's you have so many avenues open, but you just never know where you're exactly going to end up. I like that idea a lot, and I think a lot too about one of my past lives, I was a creative professional. I guess I still am creative in my personal life. But yeah, so for a number of years, I was an actor and a director and a playwright. And, I stopped eventually doing that because it just, while we're talking about this, it didn't spark joy for me. Thanks, Marie Kondo. But I think there is, especially in creative stuff, there is a latent potential in everyone to be creative. That's something that we always talk about, and something that I've always found when I do direct something is I love working with people, whether they're trained actors or not. I love working with them and helping them find the moments that matter, find meaning in their character, because everyone's got something to say. Everyone's got something creative to do, whether it's, drawing or, creating costumes or finding a way to express yourself verbally. There's so many ways and so many avenues that everyone, in a sense, has this latent potential. You just have to find the way to express it. And, sometimes you just need that one spark, that one moment of somebody recognizing it, or of you recognizing it even, that to say, hey, this is something I can do, and this is a power I have.
I mean, I like this idea, Joe, that you're kind of, flipping everything as the mental health aspect. We don't talk enough about positive psychology. I mean, we haven't as of to date. It's that idea of studying people who tend to live healthy lives, not just studying people who struggle, and seeing, what are the habits of healthy people? What are the things that people do who, that are resilient? And this idea that we all have the potential for that inside of us. It's just, how do you unlock it? What is it, how closely tied is it to our being, and how is it brought about? Is it done forcefully, which then we're talking more of this trauma type narrative that may lead to this idea that you don't recover from having your spark ripped or pulled, versus it's curated, it's brought about by nurture, or by, like you said, somebody that's able to coax that potential out of you.
That reminded me a little bit of my learning also in a previous life when I was a teacher. That reminded me a bit of my education training, and how we talked about, the differentiation needed for students of differing abilities. And a lot of people, when you say that, the assumption tends to be, okay, you're talking about students who maybe have a developmental disability or a learning disorder sort of thing. But in addition, you also have to consider students who would fall into the gifted and talented spectrum, So there is this amount of everyone has different abilities, and as a teacher especially, you have to be that person who's looking for the chance to, you're looking for any opportunity to spark your students. In real life I think does look a lot more like the Old Walker model, or even more so the Harper Prism arena model, where if you have the mana ability, or the investment of time and training into your skills, into your figuring out how to be more resilient, into all this sort of stuff to augment your own natural gifts, then that's where your potential sparks. That it isn't this innate thing that you're born with all the time, and that's the only thing that defines it. There's a lot more, I think, put on especially at least in the creative realm, a lot more about just going through it and practicing and building that stuff up.
I mean, one of the things that we do teach in a lot of our groups is this idea that even the people that we think of as having just complete innate natural talent are going to tell you they literally had to practice all the time. They did not get to where they were by just, it might have gotten them to a certain point. That talent may have been cultivated, but they still had to pick up the ball. They had to pick up the pen. I mean, you see it with writers and Stephen King's On Writing, like the number one advice is like to write. Michael Jordan being the person that he was, but he was known for his intense workouts, that he had to just like be out there practicing and doing it over and over and over again, and that there has to be a cultivation. You can't just rely on your natural talent.
It's Malcolm Gladwell's sort of 10,000 hours theory that, they did a study of, I think primarily it was classical musicians, and that to achieve mastery of your instrument, you have to practice on average 10,000 hours over your lifetime. That's sort of been taken a lot more literally these days, and the theory has become sort of butchered. But that said, it's more of a thing of you have to put in the work. You have to put in the work to realize your potential. And I know I've mentioned this anecdote in the past on the show, but it's the idea of Bill Gates didn't become who he is today because he just happened to be incredible at computers and coding and making computers. It's because he did have the random chance of some situations in his life being put there for him. His latent spark was there, but then he did have the wherewithal to gather his resources, to build up his skills, and to let that spark, once it had sparked, to blossom and flourish. Not that I think that we should be idolizing billionaires or saying that they're the planeswalkers of our universe, because I don't like that analogy, but
sometimes they're the handy examples.
Yeah. Like, let's be real. I would love to despark the billionaires and trap them on the meditation realm.
Yeah. It's just for better or worse, like the sports stars, the billionaires, they're the frame of reference that more people would have.
Yes.
Don't you dare try to put Michael Jordan on the prison realm. He already had to deal with possibly being trapped by the Monstars.
When do we get that sequel?
I mean, we could talk about the Monstars sparking when they stole the sparks from all the other NBA players.
Oh my gosh.
But see, and in that case, they, actually cared a little bit to not kill the people that they stole their sparks from.
Wow. Space Jam.
So what we're saying is Monstars not quite as vicious as Nicol Bolas.
Wait, what? We are not saying that.
Confirmed. Space Jam is in the multiverse.
That's our show. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter, or email any questions, comments, or concerns to goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. If you'd like to support your friendly neighborhood gobslugs, you can do so at patreon.com/goblinlorepod. This episode of Goblin Lore was hosted by Hobbs Q, who you can find on Twitter at HobbsQ. This episode was co-hosted and researched by Alex Newman, who you can find on Twitter at AlexanderNewM. Engineering, editing, and production for this episode is by Joe Redeman, who you can find on Twitter at Findhorn. That's FYND Horn. Our music is by Wintergatten, who you can find at wintergatten.com. That's wintergatan.com. Logo by Stephen Raphael on Twitter at Stephen Raffle. Goblin Lore is presented by Hipsters of the Coast, which you can find at HipstersMTG on Twitter or on hipstersofthecoast.com. Thank you all for listening, and remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.